Well, welcome everybody. My name is Makua, and I know most of you and have met all of you at least once. I work with Nexus Invest in Yourself, which is an initiative to work with our Nexus members in the purpose journey and work on the inner realms, leadership development from the inside out. And my colleagues are Claudia Wells and David Chang, who is on the call today, but not feeling so well, but he's with us in presence and spirit, as well as Katie Greenman, who is not on the call today either, but happy to be here today in this collaborative effort with our good friend Luciana, who is the lead on the Nexus Lab on Interfaith, Peace, and Spirituality. And I would like to let Luciana introduce herself, and then we'll carry on into this wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Makua. Well, I think the only person that I don't know here is Audri, so nice meeting you and nice seeing everyone here. The Interfaith Lab started since, I've been here in USA in headquarters since the beginning of December. And a lot of interfaith issues were happening and were popping up. I am a learning social development practitioner, recent one, and listening to these topics, this awaked in me the wish to do something regarding the interfaith issues, coming from superficial perspective, from an ordinary person. So that's how the Interfaith Lab started. And I launched it, and it was launched in a session in our summit, Global Summit, with the intention to gather people passionate with this topic and that is willing to take action about it.
Thank you, Luciana. With that, we're gonna go right in. I would like to introduce our two guests. I'll introduce Audri, if that's all right, and Luciana, you can introduce Susan, okay? Okay, so Audri is, besides being one of my favorite people on the planet, and thank you for being here today. Audri is the vision keeper who led the Trail of Dreams World Peace Walk over 6 continents between 2005 and 2009, and the 13 Moon Walk for Peace across America to over 50 communities in 2010 and 2011. As a world peace walker and advocate for evolutionary change in the world, resulting in a sustainable and viable world for generations to come, she is dedicated to expanding the teachings and visions of traditional wisdom keepers as we enter this great time of transformation on Mother Earth. Audri continues today to serve as a Global Trustee for the United Religions Initiative. And I'm happy that she's here to join us today, and her role has evolved as the evolutionary path so does, from a person who's going to offer some opening remarks in a moment, but it's also one of the people in the conversation to get today with Susan. Thank you for being here.
Okay. Thank you, Makua. I would like to, for us all, just kind of center for a moment. Let's take a sort of a uniting breath. As we breathe in, let's just feel that breath lighting every cell within, informing us. And as we exhale, we're exhaling anything that keeps us from tapping in to that perfect being that we are from the inside. And let's take another breath now and just refresh ourselves and center in the unity that exists on this call as we go forward as leaders in a world that needs us to be not only tapped in, but to use this reservoir of energy to affect the world, to make it a better place for all. And with that, just take a moment. And let's center that as we sort of in our minds go around the wheel of all of the various religions and faith-based traditions and indigenous wisdom systems, just kind of go around the wheel and feel that that energy from each hub is filling us with love and compassion, with patience, with wisdom that transcends just this time, but embraces all time, backward, present, and forward. And with that I say, Ashe, Aho, and Namin. So I think my opening remark is informed by our recent journey called the Red Flame for Freedom, where we journeyed around the country to raise awareness of issues related to modern day slavery and human trafficking and children in poverty. And what I wanted to say about that, my gift to the circle from that is the more we traveled, the more we talked and listened to each other's stories, it became so apparent to me that the answer for so much of what we see happens at the grassroots in terms of how we support one another, but also how we keep each other encouraged. So communication and sharing story is critical, and that we can expand that circle out to be informed socially, politically, and culturally, to embrace those things that are going to help us weave the stories together, the weaving of the stories, to find each person's, not only their deepest heartbreak, but how to transform. What is the key in transforming that into a new paradigm for Mother Earth and for each other? There is so much happening in the world, and we have a choice for whether we want to be disempowered by what we hear and get sucked into being overwhelmed because it's so easy to happen, or do we stand in that leader within, that power within, that I equate with, my breakthrough was with understanding Dr. Martin Luther King when he said, I stood on standing on the mountaintop, and I've looked over and I've seen the other side. For me, what that indicated, and I felt that when we finished the World Walk, and I remember it rising up in me, and I had an awareness that, wow, I can see it through my temporal body, my temporary physical state. And I can also see from this greater eternal aspect of who I am, and that the power that I can pull from that is truly the power that I have to transform the world. And so with that, I say thank you for allowing me to be a part of this call, and I look forward for all that's to come as we.
Thank you, Mama Audrey. Luciana, I'd like to invite you to introduce our other guest.
Yes, Susan. Susan, she's the Director of Religion and Peacebuilding at USIP, United States Institute of Peace. She directs the Institute's efforts to advance conflict prevention, resolution, and reconciliation projects engaging the religious sector. Since joining the Institute in 2007, her field work has focused on Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Colombia, and Iraq. And from 2010 to 2012, she coordinated an initiative exploring the intersection of women, religion, conflict, and peace building in partnership with the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University and the World Faith Development Dialogue. She co-edited a book on the topic entitled Women, Religion, and Peacebuilding, Illuminating the Unseen. Her research interests include interfaith engagement in the midst of political violence, political Buddhism, and the role of religion in hampering and propelling women's work for peace and justice. She also serves on the International Selection Committee for the Niwano Peace Prize, which recognizes religious peace builder. Prior to joining the Institute, she has worked with the Academy of Educational Development's office in Colombo, Sri Lanka, as a fellow of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School, and with the conflict resolution program at the Carter Center in Atlanta. Also conducted political asylum and refugee work with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and Advocates for Human Rights. Susan has also studied Buddhism in Nepal and is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. She holds a bachelor's degree in comparative religions from Tufts University and master's degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and Harvard Divinity School. She's currently pursuing her doctorate in theology and religious studies at Georgetown University, focusing on Buddhist and Christian theological response to authoritarianism and conflict in Myanmar. Welcome, Susan. Should I already jump in and start with the first question? Makua? Or
actually, you know what, Luciana, why don't I just first, for those who are not familiar, let me just say what USIP is.
Okay.
I think a lot of people around the country may not be familiar with it. So the United States Institute of Peace was created in 1984 by an act of the US Congress. It was actually the result of a faith-based movement that during the 60s and 70s looked around the US and said, we have all of these military academies where we send our young people and we train them in the conduct and strategy of warfare and give them an education, and they serve in the US military and in the Defense Department. And they said, what if our country made the same kind of commitment to peace building, which also requires education and skills development and as an investment that serves US interests in peace and security worldwide. So they pushed for the creation of the United States Institute of Peace, which Jimmy Carter commissioned a study to look into it. It was eventually created in 1984, not as an accredited academic institution on par with military academies, but with the mandate to support peace building worldwide, to professionalize the field of peace building, to understand what are nonviolent, non-military ways that the US and others can respond to international conflict or local conflict in their local regions and to build peace. So that's just the background of where I'm coming from and where my experiences are grounded, at least over the past 9 years with USIP. And now, please grill me.
Should I, Makua?
Of course, go for it.
Well, operating in this secular quasi-governmental organization as an ordained clergy, how do you bridge the peace, policy, and practice world with your own identity or role as a faith leader?
Okay, so, you know, part of what led me into this field was in part working with refugees and displaced communities in Minnesota, where I was working with those who were applying for political asylum in the US. And when my job was to listen to the intake interviews of these political asylee applicants and to listen for whether their story would meet the legal criteria in the US for political asylum. But what was remarkable to me was just how much religion and spirituality kept coming up in their stories. I mean, in very technical ways, it was the reason that they were being persecuted in their home countries, or it was where they found safe sanctuary in, you know, the local temple, the local mosque. It was almost 100% of the time when they got to the US who was providing support and safe sanctuary and food and housing was often faith-based communities. But it was also something that was a little bit more inchoate or subtle. It infused the way in which they talked about their experience, this oftentimes really terrible persecution that they faced in their home country, torture, imprisonment, the the experience that they had in getting out, which sometimes involved trafficking of some sort, and then trying to get out of those situations to get to the US. Great deal of insecurity, great deal of vulnerability and fear. And the way in which they spoke about those experiences and spoke about their hope for the future, religion and spirituality were so resonant in what they were saying. And it really, it got me really thinking and appreciating how religious and spiritual values and institutions and internal resources for resilience have served, you know, in addition to fueling violence in some situations and conflict, they've also served as incredible reservoirs for people to survive and thrive in the midst of violence and insecurity, and to continue to be compassionate and to choose hope and to work for peace. So that's what led me into the field. And I went to seminary where I wasn't planning on becoming an ordained minister, but I wanted to understand religion a little bit more thoroughly so that I could engage with the religious world in a thoughtful way, and in a well-educated way. And then I also got a degree in international law and relations, as you heard from my CV that Luciana provided. And it was going back and forth between those two worlds that made me realize I didn't want to do this work as a diplomat. I didn't want to engage with people living in the midst of violence and with religiously inspired peace builders as kind of a secular diplomat who's just thinking about religion in a very technical way, like how can we use religious resources to support our cause? But somebody who's doing it in partnership with them with a great deal of respect and being inspired by their own faith commitments from whatever tradition or lack of tradition, if they're spiritual but not religious, that they come from. And I wanted to do it as a ministry, held accountable for me. I'm a Christian. I've studied Buddhism a lot as well, and so that very much informs my practice and my understanding of Christianity. But I also wanted to do it in a way that I was being held to the standards, the ethics, and held within the community of my own Christian tradition and community. So my denomination, the United Church of Christ, ordained me to this work of promoting interfaith reconciliation, of working to transform violence in places around the world, doing it in partnership with those of all and no faiths. And I'm situated in, as you said, in a secular quasi-governmental institution. So I've kind of had to learn to speak in two different languages. I can speak the language of policy wonk and of international law and of the peace building system, but I also speak the language of theology and faith and religion and ritual and symbols. And part of what I see my job as doing is serving as an ambassador between those two worlds, because oftentimes the kind of secular policy world is afraid of religion or faith or spirituality, or wary about it. They think of only the negative ways in which it has impacted conflict or state politics, or they just are uncomfortable because there tends to be something of a secular bias in the diplomatic and the development spheres. So part of what I see my job is helping these two sides communicate to each other in respectful ways that help advance the common agenda.
Talking about two words, I also want to give one step in that, that I want to explore also your engagement alongside with fellow peace builders and faith leader with neuroscientists. Yeah. So please share a little bit about this engagement.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting project that we just launched this past year, and we're working, the Alliance for Peacebuilding is the organization that's leading it, but it's looking at how the spiritual dimensions of human life can help rewire the brain for peace. And it's based on what we've learned about how those growing up in situations of violent conflict, their brains develop differently. Different neuroimaging and neuro studies have shown that those living under constant environments of stress and anxiety and insecurity and human loss, that they're certain portions of their brain that regulate emotional intelligence and connectivity with others, ability to connect with others, and so on, are impacted by that. And then similarly, there's been a lot of discussion over the past decade or so between the world of neuroscience and the world of spiritual practices, particularly with mindfulness meditation. And so looking at how the brain on meditation develops in a way that expands certain neurofunctioning that relates to emotional intelligence and affects personal relations and responses to stimuli in the world in ways that have shown development of resilience and empathy and compassion even. And so what we're trying to do is bring those worlds together into conversation in a way that hasn't yet happened a great deal. There's been, within the peace building world, there has been some efforts to bring, for example, mindfulness meditation into displaced people's camps or as part of rehabilitation for survivors of violence or former combatants. But it's all very new still. And so we're bringing together neuroscientists and peace builders and faith leaders from all different traditions. We're also trying to make sure that this goes beyond mindfulness meditation, is also looking at Muslim prayer, Christian prayer, at shaman practices, other forms of contemplative spiritual practices and rituals, to see what we can learn through this conversation that might apply to the actual design of peace projects that we do, and the place that spiritual and religious practices might have as we try to help ensure that those who are still living in or who have survived environments of violence develop the internal resilience and resources that they need in order to choose peace and to work for peace and to continue to have hope and compassion and all those things I was talking about earlier about internal resilience. So it's in process right now, this project. It's to be concluded in May 2017. There's a number of various working groups within it that are looking at case studies in different places around the world, that are looking at exceptional individuals who have come out of, especially religious and spiritual figures who have come out of situations of violence and have displayed this kind of resilience, and a number of other working groups that are digging in a little bit more deeply. But we're really excited. The conversation is incredible. And we're really excited to see what the results of this are, and then how we can kind of institutionalize it, really integrate it into how the peace business is done in a way that can be more mindful.
Thank you. Very exciting, huh?
Yeah, I find that to be quite fascinating. It brings, I think, up several questions for me in looking at this question of peace, especially today in the U.S. in particular, against the backdrop of what we're hearing in the news more regularly than we'd like to, but with police violence in, particular communities, the Black community, Black men in particular. I think it's something very interesting. I wonder how that neuroscience could be applied to aid policing and aid communities in relationship to understanding more comprehensively sort of the impacts that, the pressures of situations like policing. I can only imagine what pressure that must include, but then also for the communities that are, being addressed or approached or affected. It's just an interesting thing there. Is there any consideration in the study that will help bring some of that information maybe into that fray?
I think it can. I mean, the findings haven't come out yet, so we don't know exactly how we can apply them. The U.S. Institute of Peace, a part of our mandate is that we work overseas, not in the U.S., but this is something for me. A lot of the work that I do overseas is with, for example, police and local communities in Myanmar, or is on issues of interracial, interethnic, interreligious relations. So
Right.
For me, it's very relevant to be thinking about how this work that I'm engaged in can apply to what's going on in the US right now, whether it's the police violence against the Black communities, or if it's Islamophobia or whatever it is. So I think there's a lot to be learned there. One thing that I would say is my hope is that these efforts are not saying that, you know, in the face of these structures that are unjust and that are inflicting violence on particular communities, that the answer to that alone is meditation or is prayer, right? That what it's going to result in is revealing something to us about resources that we can draw on to ensure that then the work that we do to transform structures, to transform the world, is done in a way that it's less confrontational and is in a way that is driven by compassion and so on. So
Wonderful.
even as you were saying that, Makua, I was thinking to myself, I don't want us to say that the answer to police violence is that police should meditate more, or that Black communities who are facing so much trauma and stress and anxiety in the community, that the answer to that is they should just pray more, right?
Right.
It's really about how they can draw on those resources in order to do the work that's necessary to promote justice and reconciliation.
Thank you. Thank you. Speaking of our international friends, I want to say hello to Sarah. Hello.
Hi.
Are you in the Philippines?
Yes, hello. Hi.
Hi.
Good evening.
Thank you for joining the call. Good morning, evening.
Good morning.
Happy-
Sorry to be late. I
International
took
Day
a
of
nap.
Peace.
Yes,
You're fine.
happy International Day of Peace, everybody.
We're happy to have you. We're spanning the entire day on this call, which is great. Yes, this is the fascinating research that you all are doing at USIP, and really thank you so much for sharing. I have a couple of questions I'd like to actually address to Audri, if I could. One thing occurs to me with the issues of police violence and communities in the US, there's this idea of how do you de-escalate in order to communicate? Because right now everything is at such a fever pitch. Everybody's on pins and needles, and it's like being promoted through media, social media, through commercial media, et cetera, where everybody's on edge. So there needs to be some form of de-escalation. How do we achieve a de-escalation if communication is the way, as you said, Audri, in the beginning, you were mentioning having a chance to communicate with people where they are, hearing each other's stories. How do we bring that sentiment into these areas that are just currently, you know, really, really hot and intense?
Absolutely. Makua, that's a very good question. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. That's a very good question. You know, when we are going through communities at grassroots level, particularly those that have been traumatized, there are a couple of things that come up. And the first thing I want to say is there's no silver bullet, so to speak, that will make everything go away. This is a complex issue, and we need to look at it from a historical perspective as well as where we are today. And I think that we have to always keep that in perspective. I think we also have to look at it from an economic perspective, and how as the poor are getting poorer, and there are those and others are able to continue to make more money, it has created a vacuum that is affecting how we relate to one another. And I think it also feeds the fear from one group to another. So I think we need to be mindful of that. I think the impact of that has also affected the school to prison pipeline in terms of the impact on those services that are available for people who are not able to get jobs, who are using alternative means of survival, which often is criminal as it is addressed specifically as it relates to the poor. There are double standards all around. And so I'm saying all this to say that in the space where we have a lot of unresolved historical issues around race and gender, homophobia, even interfaith, we have to take all of that into perspective. I think also we have to go back to old school now as we think about, I was trying to think what structure might give meaning to this. If we look at, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and in many of our communities that are being so profoundly affected, Makua, by police violence, by the prison, school to prison pipeline, unemployment, gentrification, and depopulation of urban areas, one of the things that we must consider is that here we are creating just children in poverty in this country is over 15 million children, and extreme poverty at about 8 million. So we're creating this a population of people whose basic needs are far from being met on the one hand, and so what that says is that new ways of coping and having value of life is being adopted that often strains the normal police, the way that we police in our country. So I think we have to be very sensitive, and that's why I think one of the most important aspects of our journeys has been, because we're at the grassroots, we sit with all of the various members, very much like a model of restorative justice, if you will, but for social and cultural repair. Listen to each other's stories, listen to each other's pain, which I call the deepest heartbreak. There's a lot of heartbreak in our communities, and with the escalation of police violence, it's even more. So I think we have to bring communities together, especially members of community that typically don't talk to one another. Without community policing now, that means there are outside people coming in to police these communities. Often there's not a connection to the community. So we have to create that with models that, again, I love the restorative justice models, and I think it can be adapted to this. I think the other aspect, Makua, I find those areas that find resilience and ways through this are communities that have adopted the arts into their way of relating to one another, whether it's mural arts, graph arts, dancing, music, expression. It tends to be a very healing practice, and it taps into that intuitive imagination. And while it is specifically a piece of work, it takes a community to create that piece of work. And so people get to work in an area that's not governed by the violence and other things that are being outpictured in society, but truly in a space of absolute creativity. And so much peace building comes out of those joint ventures. So I think we have to be creative in ourselves as peacekeepers and peacemakers. And I think we need to also begin to look at how we have models for overseas and different models here, but in the state and condition that we're in, many of our cities are basically what may be typically called third world nations now. And I think the models that we've learned overseas, we've got to bring back home and use those models to help rebuild our communities.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. While we engage this conversation, are there any questions or comments from anybody else on the call? I've muted some of the lines here, but I'll unmute them in case.
Okay, Makua, I'd also like to say I have a flight to catch shortly, so okay. I probably have about 5 more minutes before I have to get off the call.
Okay, perfect.
I really want to thank you so much for a great call.
Well, thank you. In fact, thank you. And since you do have to go, I would like to posit one other question
Yeah.
noticing that I and David alone are the two men on the call, and that there are an abundance of women on the call. I think this is a little bit reflective of our culture as it relates to peacekeeping, peace building, for example. What is something that you as women who are involved in peace building would recommend or suggest that I as a man share with other men to better engage and encourage other men to take on the role of peacemaker or peace builder? Because, you know, it just seems that there is a need, you know.
Yeah. If I may go and first, and then I'll probably sign off afterwards. Most of my work has been in the indigenous community, or a lot of it has been in the indigenous communities. And one of the things, Makua, that I think would be so important to institute in our communities is a form of rites of passage. And I think where men can help young boys go through a rites of passage. When we were in Australia on the World Walk, we met with a group of young men, and all of them had been in prison. They were Aboriginal. And they were saying to us, you know, we go to prison, and it's there that we have our rites of passage, because all of our uncles and our grandfathers and our fathers are in prison, and that's how we are getting reconnecting back to our cultural ways. I would hate that that becomes our story. And so I think that we can, and we see this happening with formerly incarcerated prisoners now coming back into community and taking a leadership role in not only co-policing, but not necessarily in the policing way, but in a protecting way, and working with the young men to develop the skills to be a positive force in their community. So my response, Makua, would be to have men who are willing to step up in community and be that elder teacher, that wisdom person, that standby person for the young men in the community, and actually create variations of rites of passage programs that can help the young men feel valued and help them with, you know, learn how to access employment if it's available, and if not, how to create viable employment options that can help them have the resources to be a contributor to their families and to their communities, and provide those basic things that we all want. That's what, to me, is that's how I see the role that men can play.
Thank you. The question is open to anybody. And thank you, Audrey. We know you have to go, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Mm-hmm.
Safe travels, and
Okay.
We'll talk soon.
All right, thank you.
Okay. And that last question is open to anybody. And then I'd like to also shift maybe a little bit into the discussion of the inner work that this question of peace building brings out, that I think is really one of the qualities that we're really interested in with IY.
And
So,
can I add one thing there before?
Sure.
Is I would also like to go for inner work, and also how does that influence what is happening?
Yes.
And how what is happening outside also influence our inner world? How? Because sometimes, because of all this crisis and these happenings, they will also invite us to go and look inside and how this influence happens.
Of course.
Well, this is Claudia, and I was just going to say that my answer to your question, Makua, just like most simply stated, is peace is an inside job. And I know a lot of men that are, you know, sort of peace activists that don't think cultivating their own inner peace is an important part of that puzzle. So that would be one very short answer. And I wanted to reflect to Susan. Thank you for everything that you shared, Susan. And there's so many amazing books on neurobiology now and how it relates to building a peaceful world. And in one of the most recent ones that I read, the author concluded that neurogenesis actually requires joy. neurogenesis is, you know, beyond rewiring to actually creating new neurons in the brain.
Interesting.
That to me is like,
Brain
what if we
is,
could get that story out?
yeah.
Yeah. Do you have the title of that book by chance,
I
Claudia?
can send that to you and you can get it to everyone, Makua.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That sounds really very interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to stay with what the speakers were saying instead of go on Google and try to remember the title.
Fair enough.
It also reminded me, Susan, of a quote that one of my mentors shared with me that changed everything for me. And his name was Willis Harmon. He was with Stanford Research Institute and was one of the founders of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And he said that it was his belief, and he was an engineer, that the greatest impediment to peace was the belief that it couldn't exist. So the work that you're doing with the meditation and rewiring the brains, especially of people who have grown up in conditions that would reasonably lead one to believe that peace is impossible, is so incredibly important. And so the last thing on this topic is just to mention the other thing that's happening in science, which is other than neurobiology that has real relevance here, is the emerging paradigm of a more holistic science, which is coming from biology and which is letting us know that, you know, this paradigm built on the selfish gene is actually, and that nature actually selects. It's called negotiated self-interest, but nature selects for what's best for the whole in negotiation with what's best for the part. And so altruism really is, there really is an altruism gene. That feels like another important lens that's coming into the whole peace building realm. Not that altruism is required anymore, because actually it's in our self-interest, every person's self-interest, that we get to a peaceful world, given all the crises we're experiencing. But thank you so much for everything you shared. I'm really grateful.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Makua, I have a lot that I can say on the gender piece.
Please do. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, because one thing that's fascinating for me is, as Luciana said, I'm an ordained Christian minister, but I'm working in a lot of places around the world where religious authority is vested primarily, if not exclusively, in men. So I spend a lot of time with men in my work in places like Sri Lanka and Iraq and so on. But it also led me to be really interested in how women religious leaders, in in a more expansive definition of leadership beyond clerics, but women who are driven by their faith and by their religious understanding or work within religious communities, are involved in peace building. That was the study that Luciana mentioned that I was involved in. But these questions of how men and women prioritize issues related to how to understand what causes conflict and prioritize different issues in peace building and what role religion plays in that has been a really fascinating one for me to explore. And one thing that's often interesting for me to note is that you tend to find that women are more religious than men around the world, by which I mean you see more women at the places of worship who are going to services, who are engaged in ritual activities. And many, many social scientific studies have shown that women will ascribe to particular religious beliefs at higher numbers than men. It's not true across the board on religious traditions, but the general trend is that women seem to be more involved in the religious world and to have religion be a kind of central part of their lives than men. And, you know, you can make the conclusion as well, looking at how men tend to be the leaders of violent movements and to be involved more in violence, which is not to say that women have not also been involved in violent movements and been involved in nationalist movements that propel exclusionary policy or that encourage men to be involved in violence. But you can say, generally speaking, that men have been more involved in actually taking up arms and leading violence. And then this women are more religious it's easy for me to kind of make a connection. Is being more involved in religious life have something to do with why women tend not to be as involved in violent movements? Of course, I don't know, but it's a question I noodle on a lot as I'm seeing these phenomena around the world. One thing that I think is really important for men to do, and this is when I'm working with a lot of, you know, imams and monks and so on, I will talk to them about this, is the role that masculinities play in conflict situations, by which I mean how little boys are taught to grow up and act as men and what that means. And oftentimes, particularly in situations of protracted violence and conflict, men are raised by both men and women around them to believe that they have to defend the community and to be violent in their defense of their community or of their family. And that's part of what then sort of legitimizes or propels violence by men who are raised in that way. And so the effort that a number of secular and religious men are involved in to try to transform that understanding of masculinity and what masculinity is, and especially masculinity vis-a-vis femininity, or how men display manliness in relation to women, and having a more a relationship that's based on equality and respect and so on, I think has been incredibly transformative in some of these environments where I'm working. And it's particularly when it's religious men who are involved in it, because religious beliefs and ideas and values play such a role in shaping gender norms. I also think it's really for women who are very aware on a daily basis of sexual violence, when they're walking down the street, when, you know, just in many ways, our vulnerability to sexual violence and our experience of power inequalities, in ways that I think minorities experience as well, is part of what makes, when I work with women religious leaders as opposed to male religious leaders, particularly those from the majority communities, the idea of that's central to peace building, of understanding different power structures and understanding forms of not just overt violence, but structural violence. It's very easy for them to catch on to it. So we had an interreligious council that was composed of men, and an interreligious council that was composed of women in Sri Lanka. And he found that the women kind of understood the concepts of structural violence and overt violence, in part based on their own experiences of growing up as a woman in their society, and particularly as a religious woman in religious structures that tend to be very, you know, to privilege men in many different ways. So that was a very long-winded answer, and I apologize, but it's your question got my juices flowing, because it's
good. No,
I think about a lot, and I didn't anticipate that I would think about a lot when I went into this field, but it, you know, by nature of the fact of often being the only woman in the room, it led me to think about it a lot.
Well, thank you for thinking about it, because I think it's definitely something that is beneath the question of peace and how we achieve peace and maintain peace, more than just on the International Day of Peace. But obviously, this is a day to celebrate that quality and that intention, that we hopefully continue to pursue that and take from this call and other examples of this day into our work individually and collaboratively. So thank you for your answer for that. Are there any other questions, Luciana, that you would like to pose, or open up to anybody else? We have about 10 more minutes.
I had a quick question that I wanted to bring up.
Barbara, thank you.
Yeah, with peace building, especially for you, Susan, it seems really difficult to monitor and evaluate the success of your projects, and I just wanted to know if you could speak a little bit more on that, maybe specifically in Myanmar, as there's so many different territories and things happening, and if the peace is moving from just individual communities like upwards throughout the military or government.
Yeah, so monitoring and evaluation is something that has taken great strides within the development world, where it's very easy to monitor and evaluate the impact of the projects. So if your project is focused on building roads, then you evaluate its success and how many roads have been built and if people are using them. In peace building, it's a little bit more difficult, especially when you're talking about attitudinal and behavioral changes, and then being able to link particular interventions with shifts in attitudes or behaviors when our attitudes and behaviors are shaped by so many different things, not necessarily one intervention. And so the peace building field has struggled a lot, but I think evolved a lot in thinking about how to do monitoring and evaluation in an effective, but still a thoughtful way. And what we tend to do so I'm actually involved in a project that's looking at how to evaluate the effectiveness of interreligious peace building in particular, and bringing some of these questions of how, especially when it has to do with religious values and so on, how do you evaluate that in a way that's not coming with particular biases about how religions should act and what are correct interpretations of religion and that kind of thing. But I mean, one of the most basic ways to evaluate the success of an intervention is there a reduction of violence at the local level. So when we were involved in supporting some of the Buddhist-Muslim relationship building and conflict prevention in and around Mandalay in Myanmar, we were looking at to what degree were these religious actors with whom we'd been working, when crisis situations were arising, tensions were arising between the Buddhist and the Muslim communities, to what degree were they intervening and doing so successfully, bringing the communities together, addressing rumors and misinformation that were fueling the violence. If the project was able to establish those relationships between communities that didn't previously exist, and communication and understanding that allowed them then to help prevent violence from breaking out, and that's one element of success. Now, linking that to like peace writ large in total state structural transformation that's a big that's a big challenge to be able to make those links. We do have particular projects that we work on where it's about how, like, trying to ensure that state institutions and services are not discriminating on the basis of religion in a way that can fuel violence between different communities or injustice. So for example, in Myanmar, we'll be working with the police there. And the police are coming from the majority Burman Buddhist community, and oftentimes the minority Muslim and Christian and Hindu and other communities feel that the police are not treating them fairly, are leaving them vulnerable when tensions are rising in the communities, and if anything, protecting the majority communities that might be inflicting violence on those minority communities. So to what extent is our work with them transforming police behavior in ways that the minority communities then are seeing and perceiving that there's a transformation of the police happening. So it depends on the project, how it's done. And it's usually, we try to keep it, smaller scale to be modest and understanding how our interventions can transform local level or specific structural or service delivery of the state without necessarily looking at peace writ large, but with the idea that those things do impact peace writ large.
Oh, thank you. That answers my question.
Oops. Hello. Sarah in the Philippines. How are you?
Hi, I'm good.
Good.
I'm still, I'm just listening because it's like 2 a.m. here,
Oh,
conserving energy, but I'm really, really grateful to listen, and I resonate deeply with the inner peace process and how it's translated, and also Susan's studies and Audri's insights as well. Yeah, I particularly in my work, it's more of creating spaces of trust and creating these through community art and community gardens or peace, reclaiming spaces as sacred. And trust building, I feel, is also a way to translate the inner into outer, and trust building in a sense that since it's not there, non-existent outside, we create that space, and that when we create that space, it allows us to the conditioning for the inside. It's much easier to have creation of peace zones or child-friendly spaces. I have no particular question in mind, but I really resonate deeply as well with Barbara's question about how do you measure, because it's a very qualitative data. Yeah, so really just resonating and appreciating. And I just wanted to say, Susan, I came across your book yesterday, and the cover of the book actually is a story from a ritual art that we designed with the community for the resumption of the peace talks. So it was really beautiful to see that, and how women peace leaders are involved in this study. So, and that struck a chord with a masculine presence in religiously motivated violence as well, and in general around the world. So thank you for bringing that up, Makoa, the gender role. Thanks.
thank you. Interesting synchronicity there. You all are collaborating in ways you didn't know.
Yeah.
It's exciting. David raised his hand. David, would you like to comment or ask a question? If you're still there, you're unmuted, so you can feel free. David?
Okay, can I ask one thing while David comes up?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I think also regarding the question of monitoring and evaluating, I want to know period of time. Because also sometimes when we, period of time, and if we have a more holistic view of everything that is happening, believing that some things, they take time to happen. So how is time when we are talking about monitoring and evaluating, and how do we look for a bigger picture when we're talking about it? Is there any conversations that happen?
Yeah, so the way that the process is sequenced is that oftentimes at the beginning of a project, let's say you have an 18-month project. At the beginning of it, you'll do what's called a baseline. So you understand, like, for example, using the Mandalay interfaith Buddhist-Muslim relations, you might look at to what degree are there already relationships in place or not between the communities, and what are the perceptions of the other community at the start of the project. And then midway and at the end, you might then evaluate those same things to see if there's been shifts, if there's more relationships in place that are constructive, and if there's more positive perceptions and more truthful understandings of the two different communities. And then, 18 months, like you say, that's a drop in the water, that's nothing. And there's only so much transformation that can happen in that time. And what's unfortunate about funding within this field is that it's often done in discrete ways. And so what I often try to encourage those who are supporting peace building is to be able to support John Paul Lederach, who's a well-known peace builder, who's based at Notre Dame. He says 10 years, that 10 years is the minimum amount of time that you should commit to doing a project in any country in order to really be able to see meaningful transformations take place. And so the degree to which peace building organizations or actors are able to commit to doing a 10-year project, and then different funders or donors can come in and support, maybe they can only do little pieces of that because of their own funding structures, but the larger project is going to see a true life cycle that can allow for transformation. And then you can go, even if it is just an 18-month project, we try to also go back 6 months, a year later to see to what degree some of the effects we're enduring. And you can measure that to a result, but again, it's always a little bit of a tricky dance, because especially if you're no longer involved in that work in that area, there's many different factors that are impacting people's attitudes and perceptions of other groups or their relationships with other groups that may not have anything to do with your project and its success or not. And so being able to kind of target in on the impact, the trickle effect of your project is a very imperfect science, but one that's certainly still necessary so that we can continue to strengthen and make more strategic peace building and ensure that the money that's going into it is being used in ways that at the very least cause no harm, but at the very best are being well used.
Great question. Great question. Thank you. I see that David has chatted his question, and then Claudia has raised her hand as well. So David's question really quickly is in relationship to your question, Luciana, how to scale faster. The 10-year window with respect to that and that understanding from having meaningful impact and measurable change. But David is suggesting, besides celebrity influencer engagements, flash mobs, and viral videos that spark awareness, in order to lessen the time for, quote, meaningful transformations to take place, or shorten the life cycle that allow for transformation. Are there any recommendations from any of your experiences that speak or lend to this as an outcome, an actual outcome? And I think this is probably affecting more the mood of the culture, it seems to me, than maybe impacting people that are really being impacted by these questions of conflict directly, but maybe changing the attitudes or moods socially. Any comments on that? How to scale faster.
So one thing that we have this project that's called Women's Rights and Islamic Constitutionalism, and it's working in places where constitutions are being rewritten or just reformed, in places where it's within Sharia, within an Islamic framework. And we're looking at how to advance and entrench women's rights within those frameworks and in the constitutions. And what we posited is that you need, in order to be able to advance that change in a meaningful way, in a transformative way, and in a sort of fast way, because these constitutions are being redrafted now, you need to bring together 3 pillars of society: the legal activists, who know the legal arguments that need to be made and through which institutions, judicial institutions, to advance them; the political activists, who know how to mobilize communities effectively, put political pressure on decision makers; and the religious scholars and activists who support women's rights, who know what are the theological barriers and how to draw on religious law and theological argument in order to advance that. And if you have those 3 representatives, those 3 pillars working together, recognizing that social attitudes and social norms, legal barriers and legal opportunities and avenues, and political realities and political power are all necessary to change structures and attitudes and behaviors, and are all sort of mutually, they all impact each other. So if you have them working in concert, then you can affect more change than if they're working individually. And we actually base this model on marriage equality in the US. So there was a pretty fast change in not only the reality of what's permitted legalistically in the US with respect to gay rights and with marriage in particular, but also a big shift in some of the social attitudes towards it. And even some of the religious language, because many of the barriers were religious in nature to LGBT rights and to marriage equality. But in the places in the US where you had those three sectors working together, hand in hand, is where you saw marriage equality pass more quickly than in other places. So like in Massachusetts, those three, and in DC where I am, those three communities work together very effectively to pass marriage equality. In California, where the legal advocates and the political activists didn't want to work with the religious actors because they felt that if we did that, then we're just going to have a big backlash. That's where you ran into problems then. And so we tried to kind of draw from that model in order to think about in other places around the world where you have barriers to social progress, particularly that are rooted in religious norms or argumentation. How can you have those three pillars working together in order to advance changes more quickly?
That's a great answer, great insight also. Thank you. Claudia, I know your hand is raised. Hello.
Yeah, so just real quickly, because I know we're at time and this was going to be a question, but I'll make it an exclamation point instead.
Okay.
It relates to the question about measurement, because I always check the Global Peace Index, which ranks the world and the separate countries and how they're doing on peace. And they came to the conclusion again this year that the world is becoming less peaceful. And they believe that peace is quantifiable, measurable, and trackable. So my question was going to be, is peace quantifiable, measurable, trackable? And Luciana, your question about time frame helped answer that question for me. But also just the exclamation point is that, how do you measure reclaiming spaces as sacred, as Sarah said? How do you measure neurogenesis or the rewiring of neurons? But there are some cool technologies coming online that are helping us measure what has previously been unmeasurable. They're loosely called transcendence technologies. So anyway, I just think this is such an exciting time to be looking at how does peace scale, knowing it begins with us. And I'm so grateful for the work everyone here is doing on this topic.
Wonderful, wonderful call. Great way, I think, to bring it to a close. It brings it to a close with a sense of hope. Thank you. Recognizing that there are some leading edge technologies that are going to hopefully help us scale peace in a more meaningful, impactful, transformational way faster.
And of course, the most meaningful of those are the inner technologies.
Peace is an inside job. That's right. That's right. Well, I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Susan, so much for your contribution today. This has been really, really wonderful. And thank you, Luciana, for your collaborative spirit and your support in helping make this happen today. This is great. I want to also thank Audri, who had to leave early, and thank you to my IY colleagues and our guests on the call today from near and far. Some are already in the future. International Day of Peace, Day 2.
Take the Peace Day Challenge online. Hashtag Peace Day Challenge, and tell everybody about one thing that you're going to do today or this year in order to help build peace in your community.
Fantastic. Peace Day Challenge, that's right.
Along with the Dalai Lama, he tweeted about it earlier today.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we'll put up a link to today's call for others to enjoy, and we'll make sure to include that hashtag as well. I don't know if this particularly qualifies, but hopefully it does. In the spirit of that, we wanted to present this call today. So thank you all very much for your time and your energy and all that you do to make the world a more peaceful place.
Thank you.
Yeah. Peace and love. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye.